Tunisia, North Africa, February 14th, 1943, 4:00 a.m. The darkness is absolute. American soldiers huddle in foxholes along the Kasserine Pass, a narrow gap in the mountains of central Tunisia. They are cold. They are exhausted. They have been in North Africa for only 3 months. Most of them have never been in combat before. They are green, untested, and about to face the most experienced army in the world. To their front, hidden in the darkness, are the German Afrika Korps and Italian armored divisions. Over 200 tanks, thousands of veteran soldiers, commanded by one of the most brilliant tacticians in the German army, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Americans do not know it yet, but they are about to be hit by a coordinated offensive designed to break through their positions, drive to the coast, and cut off British forces in northern Tunisia. The attack will be devastating. Within hours, American units will be overrun. Entire battalions will be routed, hundreds will be killed, thousands will be captured. The survivors will flee in panic, abandoning their weapons, their vehicles, and their wounded comrades. Kasserine Pass will become the most humiliating defeat in American military history. And when the soldiers who survived are asked what went wrong, they do not blame the Germans. They do not blame inexperience. They do not blame bad luck. They blame one man, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the U.S. II Corps. Fredendall was not at the front when the attack came. He was 70 miles behind the lines. In a massive underground command bunker, he had ordered engineers to dig into a mountainside. He spent weeks overseeing its construction, while his soldiers prepared inadequate defenses at the front. He communicated with his subordinates through cryptic, confusing orders. He refused to visit the front lines. He ignored warnings from his own officers that the positions were vulnerable. And when the German attack came, his headquarters was so far from the battle that he could not respond in time to prevent disaster. After Kasserine Pass, Fredendall was quietly relieved of command and sent back to the United States. He was promoted to lieutenant general and given a training command far from any combat zone. He never saw battle again. The army buried the story. Officially, Fredendall was reassigned for health reasons. Unofficially, every soldier who fought under him knew the truth. He was a coward, a fool, and a disgrace. But why? What did Fredendall do, or fail to do, that made him one of the most hated generals in American military history? Why did soldiers who survived Kasserine Pass speak his name with contempt for the rest of their lives? Why did Eisenhower, who initially supported Fredendall, later call his appointment one of my biggest mistakes? This is not just the story of one general's failure. It is the story of how poor leadership, arrogance, and cowardice cost American lives. It is the story of how a man who should never have been given command was promoted beyond his abilities, protected by the old boy network of the pre-war army, and finally exposed when his soldiers paid the price for his incompetence. This is the story of why American soldiers despised Lloyd Fredendall, and why his name should never be forgotten. To understand Fredendall's failure, we must first understand who he was and how he rose to command. Lloyd Ralston. Fredendall was born in 1883 in Wyoming. He attended West Point but did not graduate. He was expelled for academic deficiency. He later received a commission through another route and joined the Army in 1907. During World War I, he did not see combat. He served in staff positions in the United States. Between the wars, he climbed the ranks slowly, holding various training and administrative posts. Fredendall was known for 2 things: his blunt, profane manner of speaking and his skill at impressing superiors. He cultivated relationships with senior officers. He was seen as tough, confident, and aggressive. He gave the impression of a hard-charging combat commander, but he had never actually commanded troops in battle. When the United States entered World War II, the Army needed combat commanders. Officers with command experience were promoted rapidly. Fredendall, Because of his connections and his reputation as a tough officer, was promoted to Major General and given command of the US 2 Corps, one of the main combat formations being prepared for the invasion of North Africa. In November 1942, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch, the first major American offensive in the European theater. The objective was to capture French North Africa, then drive east into Tunisia, link up with British forces advancing from Egypt, and trap the German and Italian armies in a vice. Fredendall commanded 2 Corps, which was tasked with advancing through Algeria into Tunisia. His superior was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the overall commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean. Eisenhower, like many senior American officers, did not yet know Fredendall well. He had to rely on Fredendall's reputation and his performance in training. And based on that, Eisenhower believed Fredendall was a capable commander. He was wrong. From the beginning, Fredendall displayed the traits that would lead to disaster: arrogance, micromanagement, poor judgment, and physical cowardice. The problems began as soon as the 2nd Corps entered Tunisia. Fredendall established his headquarters at Tebessa, a town 70 miles behind the front lines. This was not unusual. Corps' headquarters were typically positioned well behind the front to coordinate logistics, communications, and intelligence. But Fredendall took it to an extreme. He ordered army engineers to dynamite a massive command bunker into the side of a mountain. The project took weeks. Hundreds of soldiers worked around the clock, using explosives and heavy equipment to carve out a network of tunnels and chambers deep underground. The bunker was designed to be bomb-proof, immune to artillery and air attack. The problem was that there was no threat. The Luftwaffe rarely bombed rear areas. German artillery could not reach Tebessa. The bunker was unnecessary, and the engineers and equipment used to build it were desperately needed at the front, where American soldiers were digging shallow foxholes in rocky ground with inadequate tools. Fredendall's subordinates were baffled. Why was the Corps commander more concerned with his own safety than with preparing defenses at the front? But Fredendall insisted. He personally supervised the construction, spending hours inspecting the work. One officer later recalled, "He acted like he was building a palace. He cared more about that bunker than he did about the men doing the fighting." Meanwhile, at the front, American units were spread thin across a wide front in the mountains of central Tunisia. The terrain was rough, the roads were poor, and the positions were difficult to defend. American commanders on the ground requested reinforcements, better positions, and clearer orders. Fredendall ignored them. Instead, he issued confusing, contradictory orders using a bizarre code of his own invention. He did not trust radio communications, fearing that the Germans might intercept them. So he created a system where units were referred to by nicknames, objectives were described in vague metaphors, and orders were written in cryptic language that even his own staff struggled to understand. For example, instead of ordering a battalion to move to Hill 482 and establish defensive positions, Fredendall would send a message like, "Move the horses to the barn and watch the chickens." Officers receiving these orders had to guess what he meant. Often, they guessed wrong. One of Fredendall's subordinates, Major General Orlando Ward, commander of the 1st Armored Division, repeatedly asked for clarification. Fredendall responded with sarcasm and hostility. He accused Ward of being overcautious, of lacking aggressiveness, of not understanding modern warfare. Ward, a competent and experienced officer, was humiliated, but had no choice but to obey. Fredendall also refused to visit the front. Corps commanders were expected to inspect their units, assess defensive positions, and meet with subordinate commanders face to face. Fredendall did none of this. He remained in his bunker, 70 miles from the battle, relying on telephone reports and maps. He had no personal understanding of the terrain, the dispositions of his units, or the morale of his soldiers. By early February 1943, American forces were in a precarious position. They were spread out, poorly coordinated and vulnerable. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were preparing an offensive. British liaison officers warned that Rommel was planning to attack through Kasserine Pass. Fredendall dismissed the warnings. He believed the Germans were too weak to launch a major attack. He believed his positions were secure. He was catastrophically wrong. On February 14, 1943, German and Italian forces launched Operation Frühlingswind, Spring Breeze. The objective was to break through American positions at several points, drive to the coast, and disrupt Allied supply lines. The main thrust came through Kasserine Pass. The German attack was overwhelming. Panzers smashed through American positions. Inexperienced American infantry, facing combat for the first time, broke and ran. Anti-tank guns were abandoned, artillery pieces were overrun, entire units disintegrated. At Sidi Bou Zid, 2 American combat commands were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of soldiers were killed. Over 500 were captured. Survivors fled westward in disorder. Tanks, trucks and supplies were abandoned. The retreat became a rout. At Kasserine Pass itself, American forces tried to establish a defensive line, but the positions were poorly chosen. Units were scattered, coordination was non-existent, and Fredendall, 70 miles away in his bunker, was unable to exercise effective command. Fredendall issued orders, but they were contradictory and confused. He ordered counterattacks without sufficient forces. He ordered withdrawals without coordinating with adjacent units. He blamed his subordinates for failures that were his responsibility, and he never left his bunker to see the situation for himself. One officer, trying to reach Fredendall by telephone during the height of the battle, was told by an aide, "The general is resting, he cannot be disturbed." It was mid-afternoon. The battle was raging. American soldiers were dying, and the corps commander was taking a nap. By February 20th, German forces had advanced 40 miles. They had captured thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of vehicles. The road to Despise, where Fredendall's headquarters was located, was open. If the Germans continued their advance, they could overrun the corps command post itself. Fredendall panicked. He ordered his staff to prepare for evacuation. He sent messages to Eisenhower warning that 2 corps might be destroyed. He made plans to retreat to Algeria, but the Germans did not continue. Rommel, faced with stiffening resistance from British reinforcements and aware that his supply lines were overextended, ordered a withdrawal. By February 22nd, the Germans had pulled back to their original positions. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was over. The Americans had lost over 6,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. They had lost over 200 tanks, 200 artillery pieces, and 500 trucks and jeeps. It was the most humiliating defeat in American military history, and the soldiers who survived knew exactly who was to blame. After Kasserine Pass, American soldiers spoke openly about Fredendall's failures. They called him Lloyd the Void because he was never at the front. They called him General Bunker because of his obsession with his underground command post. They said he had sent them into battle unprepared, unsupported, and without clear orders. They said he was a coward who cared more about his own safety than their lives. One sergeant interviewed years later said, "We hated him. I mean, really hated him. He never came to see us. He never talked to us. He sat in his bunker and sent us orders that made no sense. And when things went bad, he blamed us. He called us cowards, but he was the coward." Another soldier wrote in a letter home, "Our general is a disgrace. He hides while we die. If I survive this war, I will never forget what he did to us." Even officers who served under Fredendall were scathing in their private assessments. Major General Ernest Harman, sent by Eisenhower to assess the situation at Kasserine, reported back, "Fredendall is a moral and physical coward. He has no business commanding troops in combat. He should be relieved immediately." Eisenhower, who had initially supported Fredendall, was shocked by the reports. He visited the front himself and saw the extent of the disaster. He saw the poor defensive positions, the scattered units, the low morale. He spoke to officers who described Fredendall's erratic behavior, his refusal to visit the front, his cryptic orders. Eisenhower faced a difficult decision. Relieving a corps commander during a campaign would be seen as an admission of failure. It would damage morale. It would invite criticism. But leaving Fredendall in command was unacceptable. On March 5, 1943, Eisenhower relieved Fredendall of command. He was replaced by Major General George S. Patton, who immediately began rebuilding two corps. Patton visited every unit, restored discipline, improved training, and prepared the corps for offensive operations. Within weeks, II Corps was a fighting force again. Fredendall was sent back to the United States. Officially, he was reassigned for health reasons. In reality, he had been fired, but instead of being court-martialed or demoted, Fredendall was promoted to Lieutenant General and given command of the Second Army, a training formation in the United States. He spent the rest of the war far from combat, training soldiers who would be sent to fight under better commanders. The Army protected him. Senior officers who had been his friends ensured that his failure was buried. There was no official investigation, no public censure, no acknowledgement that he had been relieved for incompetence. The story was quietly suppressed, but the soldiers who fought at Kasserine Pass never forgot. They told their stories, they wrote their memoirs, and they ensured that history would remember Lloyd Fredendall not as a general, but as a cautionary tale. So why did American soldiers despise Lloyd Fredendall so much after Kasserine Pass? The surface answer is obvious. He failed as a commander. He made poor decisions, issued confusing orders, and refused to lead from the front. His failures cost American lives. That alone would have been enough to earn the soldiers' contempt. But the deeper answer is more personal. Soldiers can forgive mistakes. They can forgive bad luck. They can even forgive tactical errors. War is chaotic, and no plan survives contact with the enemy. What soldiers cannot forgive is cowardice, and what they cannot forgive is a leader who cares more about his own safety than theirs. Fredendall's underground bunker became a symbol of everything the soldiers hated about him. While they slept in foxholes, he slept in a bomb-proof shelter. While they faced German tanks with inadequate weapons, he obsessed over the construction of his command post. While they fought and died, he stayed 70 miles behind the lines, issuing orders that made no sense and blaming them when things went wrong. One soldier described it perfectly. A good general leads, a bad general manages. Fredendall didn't even manage. He just hid. And when the battle came, when American soldiers faced their first real test against the German army, they were abandoned. They were scattered across impossible positions. They were given contradictory orders. They were denied reinforcements. And their commander was nowhere to be found. The contrast with other American generals was stark. Patton, who replaced Fredendall, was constantly at the front. He visited units, talked to soldiers, shared their dangers. He was profane, arrogant, and controversial, but he was there. Omar Bradley, who later commanded II Corps, was quiet and methodical, but he understood the importance of being seen by his troops, of knowing the terrain, of making decisions based on first-hand observation. Fredendall did none of those things. He commanded from a bunker, through a telephone, using a code that no one understood. He was physically present in North Africa, but he was absent in every way that mattered, and the soldiers paid the price. At Kasserine Pass, inexperienced American troops faced one of the best armies in the world. They were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. Some units fought bravely, some held their positions until they were overrun. Others broke and ran. But all of them were let down by their commander. After the battle, the soldiers learned about Fredendall's bunker. They learned that while they were fighting for their lives, he was 70 miles away, safe underground. They learned that he had spent weeks overseeing the construction of his personal shelter while they dug shallow foxholes in the rocky ground. They learned that he had never visited the front, never inspected their positions, never seen the terrain he was ordering them to defend. And they were enraged, not just at the failure, not just at the defeat, but at the betrayal. They had been sent into battle by a man who did not care enough to lead them. They had been abandoned by a coward. That is why they despised him. That is why his name became a curse. That is why, decades after the war, veterans of Kasserine Pass would spit when they heard the name Lloyd Fredendall. The story of Fredendall is also a story about the failures of the pre-war American army. Fredendall was promoted to high command not because of proven ability, but because of connections, seniority, and the impression he gave of being a tough, aggressive leader. The pre-war army was small, insular, and dominated by an old boy network. Officers advanced based on personal relationships as much as merit. Fredendall had friends in high places. He knew how to impress superiors. He talked a good game. And in peacetime, that was enough. But war exposes fraud. War reveals who can lead and who cannot. And Fredendall, when tested, was found wanting. Eisenhower, to his credit, learned from the mistake. After Kasserine Pass, he became ruthless about relieving commanders who failed. He fired generals who could not adapt, who could not lead, who could not win. He promoted men like Patton, Bradley, and later Mark Clark, officers who had proven themselves in combat. The American army became a meritocracy. Competence mattered more than connections, but Fredendall was protected. He was quietly shuffled off to a training command, promoted to keep up appearances, and allowed to retire with honors. The army did not want to admit that it had promoted an incompetent to high command, so it buried the story. But the soldiers did not forget, and they made sure the truth was told. Kasserine Pass was a turning point for the American army. It was a humiliating defeat, but it was also a learning experience. The army learned that inexperienced troops needed better training. It learned that commanders needed to see the battlefield firsthand. It learned that clear communication, coordination, and aggressive leadership were essential. Within months, American forces in North Africa, now commanded by Patton and later Bradley, defeated the Germans at El Guetar, Gafsa, and finally in the Tunisian campaign. By May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250 Zuzurs and German and Italian soldiers were captured. The American army had proven itself, but the lessons came at a cost. Over 6,000 American casualties at Kasserine Pass. Hundreds killed, thousands wounded or captured. Families received telegrams. Mothers mourned sons, wives mourned husbands. And all of it could have been avoided if the man in command had done his job. That is the legacy of Lloyd Fredendall. Not the underground bunker. Not the cryptic orders. Not even the defeat at Kasserine Pass. The legacy is the betrayal. The legacy is the lives lost because a coward was given command. The legacy is the contempt of the soldiers who survived. In the years after the war, Fredendall gave interviews. He never admitted fault. He blamed his subordinates. He blamed the British. He blamed the terrain, the weather, the intelligence failures. He never took responsibility. He never acknowledged that his failures cost American lives. But history has judged him. The soldiers who served under him judged him, and the verdict is unanimous. Lloyd Fredendall was a coward, a fool, and a disgrace. He should never have been given command, and the soldiers who despised him had every right to do so, because a soldier can forgive many things. But he cannot forgive a leader who sends him into battle and then hides while he fights. He cannot forgive a general who values his own safety over the lives of his men. He cannot forgive betrayal, and that is why American soldiers despised Lloyd Fredendall so much after Kasserine Pass, not because he lost a battle, but because he was never worthy of leading them in the first place.